everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a bye day. And today, Amanda, in honor of Women's History Month, we're going to talk about two remarkable 18th century books. The first, which is considered the first novel about colonial America and purportedly written by a woman. And the second is a work of comparative history written by the first American woman to make her profession as a writer. So let's get right to it. Should be pretty neat. Now, the first book is a remarkable book, and it may be the rarest book we have here among all the rare books at the Midtown Scholar. It is a remarkable book called The Female American, or The Extraordinary Adventures of Unca Eliza Wingfield, compiled by herself. Now, before we get into the details of this book, Amanda, I want to talk a little bit about the publishing history, because this is considered the first American edition of the book. And you'll note right away that it is 18th century paper. It was published right in 1800 in Newburyport by a printer who was at the same time publishing sort of funeral orations about the death of George Washington and other sort of Federalist tracts. Now, why that moment to reprint a novel about American identity? Well, I can think of a number of different reasons. But for our discussion now, note that while it's 18th century paper, the exterior of the book is bound in clearly 19th century cloth with a reference number on the spine, and that's very unusual. I think to have a book rebound so quickly may indicate that the original publication perhaps didn't sell well, maybe was never bound originally by the printer and had to be rebound, or there was a special purpose. And we discover what potentially that special purpose was when we open up the title page and we see that there is a signature of a man named Benjamin Greenleaf. And here he is, Benjamin Greenleaf, with his books, I might add, very proud of his books. And he was a 19th century school teacher who taught at one of the earliest schools for young women in America, which eventually became one of the earliest colleges for women in America, called Bradford College in Massachusetts. It's no longer there today, but you could see why an instructor of young women might be interested in a book about the female American by a female author. At any rate, Greenleaf was famous for his math textbooks. These books are all his books. He sold 1 million copies of books on algebra and geometry and basic mathematics at that period. Greenleaf's Arithmetic was a common book. But perhaps in the background, you'll see this book. He clearly bound it for the school, and that's why you have an 1830s binding, stamped cloth binding with an 18th century book. Now, the book was originally published in the 18th century in England, and right away you see the author is Unca Eliza Wingfield, a strange name, Unca indicating that it may be an exotic name, and indeed Unca Wingfield is both of mixed race origin. She is the daughter of a Native American princess and a settler from the colony of Virginia, and she is also multilingual. And we find all this out when we start reading the female American. I will say one more thing about the book. They realized that it was sort of genre bending at the time, and they had to put in this advertisement at the beginning to reassure people that it would be appropriate, for both for the sensible reader and, for both sexes. But this book upends gender stereotypes like no other book of the period. Wow. So it would have been quite a radical book to read. Now, the book starts, Amanda, as a captivity narrative. Unca's grandfather is an early settler of Virginia, and her father is captured by the native population in colonial Virginia. And you see a story emerge which is very similar to the Pocahontas story that Captain John Smith wrote about. I will tell you a little bit about this captivity narrative. Let me read you just a tiny little bit so you get a sense of what it sounds like. This said, the Indians took up their bows and arrows, whilst others bound my father and his 5 unhappy countrymen and cut off their heads of the latter one after another. My father expected the same fate, But just as the executioner was about to give the stroke, a maiden who stood by the king and whose neck, breast, and arms were curiously adorned with jewels and diamonds and solid pieces of gold and silver, and who was one of the king's daughters, stroked my father with a wand, and this was the signal for deliverance. He was immediately unbound and saved. Her father goes on to marry the princess, and they have Anka, their daughter, who learns both languages and who lives both among the settlers and among the Native Americans. Now, Anka goes back to England to be educated, then comes back to the colony of Virginia, and this is clearly in the first half of the 17th century, so this is very, very early. And one other fact that you might find of interest is that the first governor of the colony of Virginia was named Wingfield, Wingfield. So wink, wink, maybe they were referring to Wingfield to give it a little more credibility along with the John Smith narrative.
Interesting.
After she returns to the colony, she packs up her things and she starts to leave when she is shipwrecked. And then the captivity narrative changes from a captivity story to a story of an island adventure in the realm of Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe. By the way, I should say captivity narratives in 17th century America were one of the most popular forms of the genre. The bestseller of all America in the 17th century was a captivity narrative about a New England person who had been captured during King Philip's War. But very unlike Anka's, because Anka treats the indigenous people with respect, kindness, has a relationship with them, and is not scared of them, which is what makes this story so different. Now, when Anka arrives on the island, she basically creates, Amanda, believe it or not, a feminist utopia. Yes, she does. Again, I said, and eventually she chooses to live on that island rather than go back, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And then her story, which is written down, ends up in her family papers and then is discovered, supposedly 100 years later, right after the 7 Years' War, and is published in the 1760s as a found manuscript.
I see.
Really pretty cool. There is there was a frontispiece to this book, which Mr. Greenleaf maybe thought was a little too much for his students, that shows Anka with her bow and arrow. And one nice thing about Anka is that, again, she didn't conform to the gender roles, and men were always trying to rescue her and always proposing marriage, but she wouldn't accept them. And in fact, she said, "I would never marry any man who could not use a bow and arrow as well as I could. But as he still continued to suit, I always laughed at him and answered in the Indian language of which he was entirely ignorant, so by degrees wearied him into silence on that head."
Good for her.
So good for her, exactly. So this is an incredible novel. It also is a sort of a tale of spiritual growth and spiritual development. It mixes all these different genres, and it talks a lot, in my opinion, Amanda, about how different America is from the rest of the British Empire on the eve of the American Revolution. In fact, it is a very radical portrait of America, and maybe does not. Maybe it's explaining that the empire will not be able to succeed because there's so many differences. A fascinating book and a great one. We don't know who the author was. Might not have been a woman, but there is much more research that can be done.
Yeah.
And I promised you a book that was a book by the first woman to become a professional author in American history, and that person was the name of Hannah Adams. And this is a beautiful book that was published at the same time as that book. Now you see a more appropriate leather binding, but also published right around 1800 in New England. And this is her third edition of her History of Comparative Religion. And Hannah Adams' father graduated from Harvard and ran a store in which he sold books. And he loved books so much that from an early age, Hannah Adams probably was surrounded by him, was able to read more books than your average person at the time, male or female. As you know, most of the books published in New England at that time were religious in nature. So the first professional book which she chose to write was this History of Comparative Religion. Now, she dedicated the book in both the second and third editions to John Adams, to whom she was not really closely related. Very, very distant cousin. But it was interesting marketing. So this is 1801. So he's now the late president. So She not only dedicated the book to him, but then she sort of traded a little bit on his name. And her father would constantly go over to John Adams' house and borrow books to read. He got the name Old Book Adams. Can you imagine a nicer name than Book Adams? And he said he'd rather be the librarian of Harvard College than the emperor of all of Russia. But Hannah Adams wrote this book. What makes the book unusual is that it was a look at religion with a sort of from an unbiased perspective. To avoid giving the least preference of one denomination over another, she basically is going to talk about all these different religions, whether it's Judaism, Islam, or various sects in Christianity, with dispassion and with facts. Never before had that happened.
Wow.
Now, all those tracts that she was reading as a young child were all about how this way of baptism was more important than that way of baptism, and nobody got along. But she wrote about all these different religions. She even wrote about, and this is interesting, Amanda, she wrote about deists and skeptics. And so this is one of the first books to really talk about skeptics or atheists. And he does not deny that what he can see, hear, or feel, but he maintains that in the inferences which philosophers have drawn from the reports of the senses, basically he relies on science. So that is the story of skeptics. And then it also traverses the world. So Hannah Adams' father also sold this book door to door, putting it in his saddlebag and traveling like a traveling salesman peddling books. But it was enough money to support the family, and she eventually got an annuity and a pension. In her later life, she wrote some other books, and she is considered the first American professional female author.
Wow.
So there you go. For Women's History Month, we have we've got a good story. Today is also the Ides of March, Amanda, and as somebody who thinks about the Roman Empire every day, because you have to in the world of ancient, classical books, I thought this would be a funny book for the Ides of March. It is by the great Cambridge historian Mary Beard, Laughter in Ancient Rome, which is actually a fairly serious book about how do we understand what was funny to other generations and other cultures, specifically to the Romans and the Greeks. Did they smile the same way we did? Did they laugh the same way we did? Well, among other things in this book, it reproduces jokes from the first ever joke book in the history of the published world. It was a Greek joke book, and I'm going to read you a joke from that joke book, and we'll see how it translates into modern culture today. And this joke book is also in honor of the newest bust to make its way to the collectible room here at the Midtown Scholar. It is Aristotle. He just came in from a collection in Hershey. Aristotle has a nice beard, and this is a joke about beards, which I think is very appropriate because if you've noticed, my beard has been getting longer and longer the more and more bi-days we do. All right. Ancient Greek humor, Amanda.
Okay.
When a philosopher was told by someone, "Your beard is really coming in," he went to the rear entrance and waited for it. Another philosopher asked what he was doing, and once he heard the whole story, he said, "Boy, I'm not surprised the people say we lack common sense. How do you know it's not coming in the other gate?" Oh, yeah, laughter. Well, so yes, Greek humor, making fun of philosophers and beards. I'll tell you a quick Roman joke also reproduced in Laughter in Ancient Rome. The Emperor Augustus is ruling. It's after the Ides of March. A peasant comes into the city of Rome. He looks exactly like Augustus. The centurions gather him up, bring him to the emperor's room, and Augustus says, "You look exactly like me. Was your mother ever in ancient Rome?" And he said, "No, my mother wasn't, but my father spent a lot of time here." Oh, that was a dangerous joke to tell Augustus, but he thought it was very funny, and the Romans did too. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next week and every week, Fridays at noon, for more adventures in the world of books.